So we're talking about atonement theology. And you might have noticed that unlike a lot of his chapters where Dr. Spong tries to give us a vision of how to redeem this thing and bring it to some kind of meaning, and he has an idea of what could be there, he just doesn't think that we'll ever get that way. So his basic thing is, we don't want anything to do with atonement theology. Here's his statement about it. Atonement theology, especially in its most bizarre substitutionary form, presents us with a God who is barbaric, a Jesus who is a victim, and it turns human beings into little more than guilt-filled creatures. The phrase, Jesus died for my sins, is not just dangerous, it is absurd. The view of the cross as the sacrifice for the sins of the world is a barbarian idea based on primitive concepts of God and must be dismissed. Atonement theology is a concept that we must escape. He's not mincing many words there, is he? He's pretty clear about his position. And if we're honest with ourselves, there's a whole bunch of where that bears truth with us. The difficulty of atonement theology is it is pervasive.
Boy.
Right? It is so accepted as truth and fact around the United States, around the world, that I think in many ways we don't know how to step away from it, even when we're trying to. Yeah. It even invades things like just the way we punish our children or discipline our children, right? That same type of mentality gets into that space. And we may even know it's wrong, but it's just so ever present. Right?
Can I ask a question and
Yes.
have you? So the original sin didn't come in until 400, and the substitutionary atonement didn't come around to 1000, I believe.
Yeah.
So when Paul said Christ died for our sins, did he have something else in mind?
Yeah, I think that we need to get there, but let's
Okay.
stay for a little while in the problem, because I think there's two things that we need to kind of do today. First of all, figure out how do we deal with how atonement theology continues to have presence and effect on us and even within us. And then the second thing is, Dr. Spong just says we got to get rid of it. He talks about the at-one-ment, that at-one is the better definition. He just doesn't think that we can get there because of how atonement theology is already there. And so what do we do instead of? What else can we do to try to help? So that's the second half of the discussion, and that's where you're at, Ron. But let's stay for a second in just where is atonement theology still present, not just in other people who do it really wrong, but still there and active in you in some way and around you? Where do you still fight with it?
I'm going to say, it's been over 30 or 40 years since I sat through a hellfire sermon.
Yeah.
But it's to use mythological terms, it's a night demon. It's something that gets you in the middle of the night. Not that I'm dreading going to hell, but it's just that feeling of I can never be good enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ever.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like change. It weighs me down personally.
Yep, absolutely. That's exactly part of my own thing, is that there's just things that I was told that still affect me. One of the people in this afternoon's class told a little story, and he said, I apologize if it's a little crude, but he talked about when he was 12, 13 years old, and a deal he made with God that if God would save his dog, then he wouldn't masturbate anymore. And because the dog came in quickly, all of a sudden that guilt of every time since that moment just became a guilt that just continued to weigh. Right. And isn't that very present? I mean, it's definitely present for me, where I heard or said these things are wrong, and too often that record still plays in my head. Even though I, in many ways, have moved beyond it, it still just is there and present.
Yeah, I have people that that will come up and ask me for prayer. And I'm really, I think because of where I'm at in this church, and surrounded by this group of people, I'm very aware of what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And sometimes you just slip into that stuff of that substitutionary thing that Jesus did on the cross for us. And it is so frustrating because it's just like rote memory. Certain words start coming out and then these other words come out.
Right.
And it's really frustrating and has really slowed my prayer process down.
Yeah.
In terms of thinking about what do I want to say now that maybe the other person will relate to, because this part of progressive Christian theology is definitely in the minority.
Yeah. And the other part about that is, as people ask me to pray for them, is how not to pray in such a way that all of a sudden I lose credibility in their mind. Right?
Yes.
I want to be their pastor. I want to be able to help them have something from this moment that assists them. But it means that sometimes you're right, that the easiest path is to slip down into a theology that I don't believe.
And I write it off as, well, I'm trying to reach that person and their faith, because it's their faith, or in my belief, it's their faith that's going to either help them or not. It's not anything I say or do.
Yeah.
So I don't want to, it's like I justify that slipping by going, oh, well, I'm just, getting at their vibration.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's not necessarily wrong, but it also comes with the guilt of, damn, why didn't I? Why couldn't I? And all of that. And the difficulty is because all of this, for me at least, the difficulty is because all of this is so everywhere. It's just so present and so unquestioned that it's hard not to have that. It is like an overlay over everything that we do. And yet, kind of like the blanket over top of a body in a bed, it shows very little good detail. Right? It's a very poor way to be able to view whoever that person is in bed.
Yeah.
Right? You see the general outlines, but not much else. And I think that that's what I feel about this is atonement theology kept us at a very low level of understanding and of acting and being in the world. And we forced ourselves to stay there rather than move to better and better levels.
Jim, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Why, the one thing that bothers me with Spong with this is that he seems to me anyway, he seems to be saying, well, we have to change the whole church, the whole all of Christianity has to change to what we're believing, or what I'm saying right now. And I guess I just disagree with that premise that, if there are enough people that don't believe in atonement theology in this world, that if it were just talked about, people would come together. The word would get out and people would come. It's like, you build it and they'll come. rather than trying to figure out how to say it in such a way that every fundamentalist preacher is going to stand up and say, oh yeah, you're right. And we're going to start talking about that way. So anyway, maybe I'm wrong, but
I don't think you're wrong, but I think there's several reasons why he does this the way that he does. First of all, one of my big things about Bishop Spong is he always says things maybe even stronger than where he himself is at, because he thinks there has to be a move. And in this, he's particularly bold about that atonement theology is just keeping us at such a low level of spirituality that it's such a cap on our collective ability to move, that unless it's gone, I think he fears that we won't be able to make that move. So that's at least the first thing I would say. The second thing, though, is I think he's trying to lay out a very strong case for future. What is it that, I mean, I think he thinks like I do, that we are in a place where it has forever changed. A friend of mine wrote a book, an article this week about evangelicalism. And he says, evangelicalism in its current form is not dying, it is already dead. It has already lost all of its power. And I think that's what Bishop Spong thinks about atonement theology, but it sits heavy on us still. Even though it's lost all its power to do anything, we don't know how to escape it because it's so omnipresent. And so I think that's why he speaks so strongly about this.
But why is it then that the churches that are evangelical are the ones that are large and thriving and growing?
They're not necessarily growing, Deborah. They are large. They have grown in the last 10 years or so, but they also lose people on a regular basis. And so my friend who wrote that article I told you about said that the majority of the people who in those churches are saying that's not me are the ones who will not stay in a church like that, because that church has church has essentially sold its soul to the political right, and has lost its ability to be church any longer. That's
So
his point.
Can I add that from what I understand from his writings is that the Christian scriptures were written in first century language and under concepts which we no longer hold, and it was of a specific place in a specific time. So as I understand what he's saying, there's something core in that message, but we cannot literalize it and we cannot put it in the terms of, he uses a term, turn our minds into first century pretzels.
And I think that idea of literalism, I think, is very essential here. I think that we have taken something and turned it into what was very unlike what Jesus meant or what most of the great teachers of the world meant.
And I would say, I mean, and I like Rachel Held Evans. She passed away, but she was somebody who also was really struggling with the church.
Yes.
She calls herself a post-evangelical. But I think there's something in that movement about transformation, about making a decision as an adult, as the equality of all souls, that I think is valid. It's just that it's turned the wrong way. And then you also have to think of, you also have Jim Wallace of Sojourners, and you have Mel White.
Yeah.
So it's not all Jerry Falwell's. And
Yeah, there's a lot of good teachings there, but there's a lot of good where it's gone into paths that are not sustainable as a Christian organization, if I can say it that way. Maybe it can sustain as a political organization, but is that what they want? Is that what is good for their purpose? So let me also address it this way. One of the things that we get wrong in Bible is we forget that the whole of Bible is myth. Now, we don't like to say that word about Bible. Maybe we can apply it back to the earliest parts, because maybe that sounds like myth. But from a Christian point of view, we think myth means Odin or Zeus or one of those parts of the world that is not as enlightened as we are. Okay? But myth means much different than what we typically say. We tend to say that means made up stories that have no basis in truth. But by that we mean fact. Myths tell deep truths. They may not be factual. And there's a very real difference between fact and truth. Fact means it happened, or this person has green hair, or whatever it happens to be. Myth is something that gives deep and broad meaning. And that's what Bible is all about. Now, it doesn't mean it's perfect. Truth doesn't mean that everything that it says is exactly that way, because people put their own opinions into myth. But it has something to do with trying to draw us towards a different, deeper something than what we currently have. The problem is that we think that the best way to determine something is if it's factual.
Mm.
Fact has more rightness to us than unfact. But my granddaddy, I think I've told you before, used to say, if you tell a lie big enough that nobody believes it, then it's not a lie anyway. And in many ways, that's what I think the Bible is supposed to be. The Adam and Eve story is a lie if we're trying to make it factual. It's deep truth if we keep it on the mythic. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And for some of my friends, that's almost heresy, what I just said.
Yes. Yes.
And yet I think that's very biblical. They tell stories. Jesus did nothing but he didn't preach. He told stories and said, what do you think? How does it move you? He told truth and then trusted that they could do something with it. We don't do that any longer. We tell facts. We have this thing that says this is where it all lies. Atonement theology says this is what goes on. And we keep it all at this controllable, understandable level, rather than trusting in the people around us. I have a friend of mine. I might have told you this story before. I tell it a lot because I'm continually not happy about it. Sherry is a good friend, and she is a lay speaker, preacher. She'd go around the world, and she said, Jim, I've learned that if I just tell a whole bunch about how bad someone is, that it only takes a little bit of grace to be able to save them. Yeah, but Sherry, is that the gospel? Is the gospel about how bad you are, how sinful you are, and a little bit of grace? Or is it about a whole lot of grace? Which is it? Do we want just a little grace or a lot of grace? Instead, we go with the easier, a whole lot of sin, and we don't need much grace. You see how we sell our soul in that?
Can I bring something up? Because this has been, so I will admit that, you know, the big thing is that after you were saved, you were supposed to be better. And you could just, you know, if the devil knocked on your door, you just send Jesus to answer.
Yeah.
But it caused me to be dishonest about myself. It caused me to feel lust, and then to either deny it or feel guilty about it. And it's like, like anything that you felt that was wrong. And I'll just use a brief example. 20, 30 years ago, I took a honesty test because I was looking for a low wage job because I was trying to survive. And there was a national honesty test, and you had to answer all sorts of questions. You had to not think about it.
Uh-huh.
And so it asked you, like, if you saw, and I when I worked at Kmart and saw money, I thought about taking it. I never did. When I was struggling paycheck to paycheck and I saw a wallet full of cash, I thought, well, I could at least take 20 and put it back. So I thought about it, but I turned the whole thing in. And I had to walk out because I couldn't just answer that test. But they finally threw it out because it was people who were really honest with themselves couldn't take the test.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't valid.
Right.
And so I just bring that up. Is it part of what you want is to be able to acknowledge that part of you and not get caught. I mean, and I'm taking awareness meditation. It's just being able to accept it and move on. And then it just moves on.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think honesty is a very good way for us to be able to measure this. Are we accepting lowest common denominator honesty, or do we truly want people to delve into the depths of who they are and be honest about the good and the bad with that? Right? Because ultimately, if I stay just pretty, I never get to what's most important. I have to get to the honest parts of me to be able to have that ability. And atonement theology makes you, like you said, Ron, in too many cases, act like you're saved, like you have no problems any longer. I'm fixed, but you're not. Right? And so you keep pointing the finger at somebody else instead of continuing to be honest about yourself. I don't think that's helpful for us as individuals. Is it?
Yeah. And then at worst, you project what you can't accept about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. We do an awful lot of projection that way. You're right. The hard part is that atonement makes control easier.
Mm-hmm.
Limited options, low level of, keeps things in a controllable space. And if that's my goal as a church, then that's the way to be able to fulfill it. But like with my friend Sherry, is controlling people, making them know how awful they are. Is that what the church really is? Or is there something greater that we're trying to pull out of each other? I believe it's the second. But we've often sat in the first. Looked like you were going to say something, Deborah.
Well, I'm just all Spong just makes me think. So, I was just thinking in terms of control. Oh, yes, atonement theology makes it so much easier. And as pastors, it makes life so much easier. And while it is not the fault entirely of the leadership, a lot of this lies at the feet of leadership. Because if I have a church and I've got all these people going in and going out and doing this and doing that and trying to keep my little herd together, man, it's just easier to not let every one of them be on their own spiritual path that they're on anyway, to
That's
God.
right. Do I trust? It comes
Yeah.
down to for a
And that
pastor.
must be hard for you.
It's always hard. I think it's hard for every single pastor, especially when you see somebody who seems to be more destructive.
Mm.
Right? And the easiest thing to do, let's say that person is there and you see them beginning to drink again when they've clearly had issues with that before. The easiest thing to do is condemn them as sinner, yell at them. The more difficult thing is to sit there with them in the midst of all that and try to figure out how to help them find the strength to be able to make what you think are the right choices. Having preset right choices is really much easier for a pastor. But it delays what I think is one of the chief things in religion and spirituality, and that is trust. And trust is a much more challenging road, not because people aren't trustworthy so much as trying to figure out how to trust each other and be in that relational. It just takes time, right? I look at Jesus himself. Jesus didn't save the whole of the Jewish nation, didn't fix all of Jerusalem. You know what he did? He trusted 12 disciples and probably a few others. He trusted a very small, intimate group of folks and trusted that they would be able to do afterwards the work that needed to be done. So he didn't try to fix Pilate necessarily. He didn't necessarily try to fix the chief priest. He trusted Peter, who was kind of a fallible human being, right? To take the next steps. And the hard part is we like being the ones who do the next step, not the ones who have to be trusted beyond. That's hard. So far, I'm not giving you really good ways to get out of this.
Yes, I noticed.
But that's the problem, is that atonement theology is so pervasive that it's hard for us to think how to get around it, even just in our own lives, let alone with changing the world. Because Joyce, you're right that if it's truly good, we should be able to find a way to get through it and change the world with it. But it takes some time, and there's a lot of other force behind it.
I don't know that it's necessarily that it's up to us. I think that God just wants us to present the opportunity for people to become enlightened.
Yeah.
That, we just have to put the words out there and people will find it that are supposed to.
The hard part about that, Joyce, and I don't disagree with you. You know why atonement theory works really well? Is because it's often tied to the belief that, well, now I have the right truth. I'm the only way to get that atonement happen. And so there's an evangelical zeal that easily clasps itself to that.
Yeah.
Leftist theology tends not to be the evangelical, let me go convert other people. So it sits in the how should I say it? It sits in the doesn't propagate itself well space. So I found enlightenment here, but am I doing anything to enlighten others? Now, most of the great leaders, for example, the Buddha was not a non-evangelical person, but he was differently evangelical than like Mormon missionaries going and knocking on doors, right? Much of the people who easily hold on to atonement theology do a lot of propagating of. Enlightenment people don't do that as easily or as well. And yet I think we should. If it's truth, if it's a way of finding something, if it's that which will change the world, why don't we grasp it with more of an urgent hand like that?
I think there's a danger, and just looking at, I think there's a danger then of becoming what we're trying to pull people from.
Yeah.
Because in order to do that, we would have to find a way to do that doesn't say our way's better.
Yeah. I don't want to become like them. Right?
Right. I also don't want to denigrate them, at least from what I'm thinking at right now, because there are people I don't know who I'm just going to say, who would necessarily grasp enlightenment, who would necessarily grasp the idea of not atonement, but they still benefit from being in an atonement theology place. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because I'm not trying to say that there's that enlightenment is the right word for everyone. I don't want ever for that to sound like what I'm trying to say. I'm just saying that there's got to be some way that we become more active in helping people discover a different way of viewing things, especially today, because you know what's happening today is where all churches are losing right now is in their younger folks. This type of theology is not holding the majority of the younger crowd, any kind of theology right now. Why? Because we're not speaking a language that makes any kind of sense to them.
Mm-hmm.
But to do that, we have to step beyond what we already know. So maybe atonement and enlightenment, either one is the wrong wording, the wrong view of. Do we trust them to be able to do we trust them to change us rather than us change them?
Well, let me give you an example. So I worked with a dear Filipino lady who has a table. She lives alone, and she has a table where Jesus, Mary, and Joseph sit next to her. And she heard that the Virgin Mary had told somebody that put these special essence oils on your neck, it will protect you from COVID. And so rather than in my younger days, I'd probably say, just there's no proof for that, but it's just kind of a gentle, that's good for you to just make sure that you wear your mask and be careful. And it's, I think from my understanding, the parables of Jesus were ways of, they were never the same, but they were ways of having dialogue with people to move to a larger picture. And that's a harder way of, as a teacher, that's a harder way of teaching as someone who's working with people, that's a harder way, and it doesn't, I don't know how it carries out, but it's just I guess it's an honor of, well, I'm going to use namaste, the spirit of God from the other person, even though we are quite different.
Yeah.
It's almost a path more than a step-by-step way.
Yeah. But the hard part is that if I'm sitting looking at a mountain and I see a really simple path, I can see it laid out in front of me. My tendency is to want to say, you got to come over here. But there might be somebody who's 1,000 feet up that mountain, but out on a promontory that looks dangerous to me, looks like there's no way beyond that. But is it better for me to call them down to my path, or to acknowledge that where they're at might be a good path? I think that's what we tend to do, though, is say, mine's the better path. He should come my way. I'm not certain.
And it goes back,
Go ahead.
I was going to say, it goes back to that trust. I don't want to, it's hard to trust that the person that I'm with is hearing or feeling or whatever it is that you relate to in spirit the same way that I am, if it looks strange to me.
Yeah.
I want your path to look at least sane, like my path looks sane to me. And to trust someone, to let them walk it out. And even if it turns out to be what looks like a disaster, I don't know what all's in that path that may actually benefit them.
Right. And so we repeat words like Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the light. Right? And we insert a word into that phrase. I am the only way, the only truth, the only light. I don't think that's what Jesus was saying. And yet it's easy for us to assert that. Why? Because it's simpler. I have the truth now. I don't have to any longer worry about it because I'm on the way. You have to worry because you're not here. But there's millions of instances that I've seen where there's not a simplistic, easy, singular answer. If a marriage is failing, for some couples, coming back together and working on it is the right answer. For other people, other couples, that will lead to murder.
Mm-hmm.
And they need to leave each other, right? And just a singular, it has to be this way, is not the right answer. Somehow we have to learn how to trust what's going on with those people in that relationship to know what's the right answer. Too many times, pastors have been guilty of sending abused women back to their abuser.
Yes.
Yeah.
Horrible thing for us to have done. There's different paths, and sometimes they seem to be going in different directions. But that's because there's not a singular answer. I think that every generation, their job is to overthrow the other generation, the generation that came before them. And I mean it almost that much, that harshly, because for my movement, for example, of moving away from Mormonism over through my mom's movement from Methodism into Mormonism. That was her conversion. I went the opposite direction, overthrew what my mom had done. And it's still difficult for her. Like, she accepts that this is the right path for me, but it's not a simple thing for her to do.
And it's the older generation's responsibility to fund the younger generation overthrowing us.
Yeah, that's a difficult thing. And so it will always feel somewhat like that, you know, to the older generation. For the younger generation, I think it's often just a pathway. Sometimes it is I'm going to overthrow that damn stuff. Other times it's just nope, this is the truth that I have to follow. This is the right thing for me to do.
I'm wondering if I can bring up an analogy, and this again, just
Yes.
because my life has been immersed in teaching. But you know, when I was teaching elementary, you were just going over this is the way we do it. But when you get into more abstract thinking, you can come to passages in poetry or books where you can have more than one interpretation.
Absolutely.
In math, there are several ways to solve a problem. You come up with the same answer, but there's several different paths you take. And then part of growing up spiritually is going from the very basic, which works at one level, to a larger level. And I mean, at least in my experience, leaving evangelicalism was just part of becoming an adult.
Yeah. Well, let me develop that idea just a little bit, because I was really good in math. Math was my best subject in high school. Miss Fenner had me on what was called the math facts. No, math. I don't know. Anyway, it was how many math things could you do in like 10 minutes, right?
Yeah.
And it was a competition. And when I hit calculus 2, I failed completely. Took it 2 times and barely made it even the second time. And you know why? Because I'd been taught, as many people have been taught, that math is about getting to a right answer. And you know why we do that? Because it's simpler. Get to a right answer. Even if you show multiple ways of being able to get there, there's a right answer to get to it. Calculus 2 is where it moves it into what math truly is. Do you know what math is? It's a language. It gives you words and phrases and ways to be able to combine things together, to be able to speak and understand and move into greater understanding. And if you're busy just trying to find a right answer, you're at a very low ability to use that language for what it's worth. And so you die in the water. And typically the time when you die is calculus or calculus 2. And good mathematicians can't go any further than that because they've only been taught right answer. And I think in many ways, that's what atonement theology is doing to good spiritualists, is it's made it so that we can only get this high and we don't know how to break through that. And that's why I think Spong is taking such a drastically grim view of atonement theology, because it holds everything down. And he knows that we're capable of so much more. So, dream. How is it that we move beyond? What do we do now to become something more than this that has held us? How do we begin to step into that better world?
Ayahuasca. No, I'm sorry. Man, that is tough.
Well,
Go ahead.
yeah. To stick with the analogy, I mean, I only went through my first year of calculus, but I was able to skip the first class because I had a good teacher in high school. And if we approach the way that we teach, and I shouldn't say teach, but if we approach the way that we do spirituality, if we move in different ways so we allow that growth, then it's possible. And just use an example from the day. So I'm beginning to switch out of, you've got to set limits with middle school students. And when this class came in and there's people that are right next to each other and you know they're going to cause trouble, my usual step is to right away, please move over there.
Yeah.
But today I was just, I'm going to trust, I did use the word trust. I'm going to trust the two of you are going to show me that you can hang together while I'm talking. And when eventually there's going to be a time where I have to separate them. I must say, I had to say that 3 or 4 times today, and it was fulfilled. So it's the ability to step out and trust, knowing that you may have to make other changes, but just throwing that trust on the other person. And that's the opposite of believing that they're sinful and incapable of any possibility.
Yeah. Trust is a hard thing to develop, especially when someone is relatively not trustworthy yet, as are most 8th graders.
Yeah.
And yet that's the thing they seek most, isn't it? They want to be trusted.
Yes.
And when they aren't, it's hard.
I have St. Francis to look at in terms of a group of people that seem to not be all that in love with that particular theology, redemptive theology. But I'm kind of like, what do other churches do? What do other groups of spiritual communities do that embrace this idea that we need to move beyond that?
Yeah. One of the best things about St. Francis is exactly what you just said. St. Francis does a better job of trusting than any other church
I've seen. Any other than I've seen. Yes, I agree.
And part of that is because there's not a sense of, I have the one correct answer. And that holding on to a singular correct answer makes it so that I have to fight for my thing, makes it so that I have to make you grasp it. But St. Francis broadens things. It makes it into a very large spectrum that is both acceptable and honored and welcomed there. A lot of people are given a voice here. And you know why we don't like that a lot of times? Well, let me tell you about one thing. That at Yuma, prayer time we would do, who has a prayer to lift up? And Kathy would always raise her hand and people would groan. She was going to say the same thing every single damn time. And we don't like to trust each other, that's where she needs to be right now. The more you give permission, the more some people will abuse it. Okay, it gives an ability for that abuse to happen. But that was a way that Kathy got to have her voice heard for a moment, which was kind of untypical of her life. Most of the time she didn't have her voice acknowledged. And so for a few minutes she did.
But then was there an effort made to teach Kathy how to have her voice without doing it this way?
Yeah. I try to talk with her and help her to be able to do it more, but it's just difficult. There's lots of ways that you see that same type of thing. So-and-so is busy asserting their truth. So-and-so is busy taking their thing and thinking that everyone has to be like them. And St. Francis is really good at being authentic to their truth, but not necessarily saying that everyone else has to have it. Now, that's not completely true.
Right.
If someone comes in here with a gun wanting to shoot all those damn gays, there would be people at St. Francis who would stop that, and rightfully so, right? We will draw lines, but I think St. Francis is better at not having to have a singular right answer.
So do you think then that embracing this is actually, that we're actually on a really good footing for stepping into the future?
Absolutely. I think St. Francis has a better sense of where, if Dr. Spong is correct, that we're on the verge of moving into the next phase of what is spirituality in the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
St. Francis is stepping down that path much more willingly and skillfully than any church I've ever been in.
Yeah, I have to agree. I really, I mean, well, I'm always going on about how grateful I am I found St. Francis.
Well, let me bring up this story. And I came in 1988, but it was totally, David said that we used to have open sharing in the services. And somebody who was fundamentalist came and said, why aren't you talking about Jesus? And quite sharp. And it had to be, I mean, you do have to set limits. And if you've ever watched Spong, and he'll have a question and answers, he sets limits on people's meandering questions. But out of that, St. Francis was supposed to be founded on getting away from that theology, and that was the first time that the subject of Jesus was brought up at St. Francis. And so it's ability both to set limits and then to bring in something larger. And it's difficult, but I think it's the challenge, and I think we've done it quite well.
Yeah, it is an ongoing challenge, because as soon as you open yourself up to that, then there's somebody who wants to take it the next step down the road in any number of directions.
Yes.
Right? And is that okay? And can you allow that to be okay? Well, not always easily, because as soon as somebody comes in who takes this space, then somebody way over here says, yeah, I'll go further afield. Right? And so you, being able to hold that balance. That's why, for me, the best thing that St. Francis does is not theology. It is a choice to continue in a relationship in the midst of theology, practice, understanding that is very diverse. So it's a choice of relationship that
Mm-hmm.
makes it so that St. Francis does what it does well.
But there's something, and there's something we're missing though, if we're not growing, and I don't know if that's simply marketing, you know what I mean, or what, because that is a huge concern there as well, is the fact that I hear stories all the time since I've been there about the good old days when it was so vibrant, when blah blah blah. Now to me, it is vibrant. I mean, I look at the size of the congregation and the work that is done in the community, and I'm just amazed at the connectivity between the two. But I also think that it's a very valid point. Then how do we get this kind of thing out so that people realize we have built it so they can come?
Yeah, and part of that is marketing, but again, there's a fear of marketing because that's what those type of churches do, or that's what we don't want to become business, and
Right.
yet there is some of where that needs to be there. The hard part about all of this is that formulas like atonement make it easy to define a path. And so it's very simple to throw the formula at somebody, but it keeps you blocked at a certain space, like my experience with calculus. And it's hard to go beyond that. How do we allow the movement into higher and higher senses of being to occur? The bad part is that I know that right now you each have the exact right answer on your lips about that, but we've run out of time. Otherwise, I'd let you solve that today.
Yeah.
We next week we are going to talk about Easter. There's a lot of reading. 3 chapters from Unbelievable, but there's a couple of different books as well. And they are all worth moving into. Easter is a big subject. What does Easter become? It takes a lot of room in each of the Gospels. What is it and how do we use it today? Especially if we're moving away from the Jesus died for my sins type of theology. If that's not as easy for us to use or work with, what do we do with this story, which takes up so much of the Gospels? All right. Thank you for your time today. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
Are you sending out chapters
Yeah.
again, Jim?
I will send out chapters. I usually have gotten them between the two classes, but today I'm going to do them before I go home. So you'll have them in a little bit.
Okay, thank
Good.
you.
Right.
Do you have
Good night.
Good night. Do you have a minute or two to talk about it all to Ed?
Yes, let me pause the recording here.